My name is Demi Pritchard and I am 26 years old. 8 months ago, my mother forged my signature on a transfer document and handed the deed to my grandmother's property over to my sister. Not borrowed it. Not temporarily reassigned it. Transferred it. The cottage on Folly Beach that Grandma Loretta had spent 30 years paying off. The same property she signed over to me on my 25th birthday with her own hands and her own tears, was no longer mine according to the Charleston County property records. My mother had walked into that office with a notarized document I never signed, and by the time I found out, Tiffany had already hired a contractor to start renovations. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I sat in my car in the parking lot of my apartment complex and stared at the document my grandmother's attorney had forwarded to me, and I felt something go completely cold inside me. Like a part of me had been waiting for something exactly like this my entire life. Then came Grandma Loretta's 75th birthday celebration. A dinner party at the Spectator Hotel in downtown Charleston, white linen tablecloths, crystal glasses, 38 relatives who hadn't all been in the same room since my grandfather's funeral. I arrived alone. I sat near the end of the table. And when Grandma Loretta asked me across the room how I was enjoying the cottage, how the garden was doing, whether I'd finally fixed that stubborn latch on the back gate like she'd always meant to, my mother smiled from her seat at the head of the table and answered before I could open my mouth. She told everyone that Demi had generously decided the cottage made more sense for Tiffany. That I'd agreed it was the practical choice. That I was so selfless, really always putting family first. 38 people heard that. 38 people smiled and nodded and raised their glasses. And Grandma Loretta went very, very still. What happened next is the reason I'm telling this story today. Before I go any further, if you're new here and this kind of story speaks to you, please take a moment to subscribe and hit the notification bell. I share real stories about family, boundaries, and what happens when people finally stop quietly absorbing every wrong done to them. If that's the kind of content that resonates with you, I would love to have you here. Now let me take you all the way back to the beginning because none of what happened at that dinner makes any sense without understanding what came long before it. Growing up in Charleston, South Carolina, our house was a tall, narrow Victorian on the edge of the Wagoner Terrace neighborhood. Spanish moss in the yard, a porch that creaked in 3 different places, and a family dynamic that I spent most of my childhood trying to decode and the rest of my adulthood trying to survive. My parents were Gerald and Patricia Pritchard. Dad ran a small insurance brokerage out of an office on King Street. Mom managed the household with the kind of iron efficiency that looked like love from the outside and felt like something else entirely when you were on the receiving end of it. There were 2 daughters in that house. Tiffany, 5 years older than me, blonde, charming, effortlessly magnetic, the kind of woman who walked into rooms and immediately became the center of them without appearing to try. And then there was me. Darker features, quieter energy, more comfortable with books and long silences than with the performance of being the Pritchard family's shiniest product. Tiffany was the one mom dressed up for church photos. Tiffany was the one mom called first with news, good or bad. Tiffany was the one whose school recitals we never missed, whose college applications mom personally proofread line by line, whose wedding mom spent 11 months planning like it was a ticketed public event. I was the one who was told from a very young age to be understanding, to be patient, to not make things harder than they needed to be. Mom had a specific phrase she reached for whenever I pushed back on anything. She would look at me, tilt her head slightly and say in the most measured tone imaginable, "Demi, don't be the difficult one." Not a shout. Never a shout. Just a quiet, surgical little sentence that told me exactly where I stood in the architecture of our family. Don't be the difficult one when Tiffany took the bedroom with the window seat because she said she needed natural light for her sketching. Don't be the difficult one when family vacation plans shifted to accommodate Tiffany's sorority schedule and my own plans simply evaporated. Don't be the difficult one when Tiffany's wedding rehearsal dinner landed on the same weekend as my college graduation and Mom said, "Well, Demi, you understand, don't you?" And I did understand. That was the worst part. I understood perfectly. I just didn't matter as much and everyone in that house had quietly agreed to that arrangement without ever putting it to a vote. The word difficult became the cage they kept me in. Small enough that I barely noticed the bars. By the time I was 22, I had built something that was entirely my own. I worked as a paralegal at a mid-sized firm in downtown Charleston, rented a small apartment on Rutledge Avenue, and had learned to stop measuring my worth by how much space my family allowed me to occupy. I came to Sunday dinners. I sent birthday cards. I kept the peace. I had learned that keeping the peace was its own kind of survival skill when the alternative was being labeled the difficult one in front of people who had already made up their minds. Tiffany by then had married a man named Craig, had a daughter named Lily, and had settled into the life our mother had always blueprinted for both of us. She had a house in Mount Pleasant, a minivan, a husband who coached youth soccer on weekends. She was the finished version of what our mother had always wanted. I was the rough sketch left in a drawer. The cottage changed everything. Or was supposed to. Grandma Loretta had owned the Folly Beach property for 30 years. It was a small weathered beach cottage about 20 minutes from downtown Charleston, the kind of place that smelled like salt water and old timber and something that felt permanently like a Sunday afternoon in July. Grandpa Harold had bought it the year Grandma Loretta turned 45, a surprise anniversary gift that she said made her feel, for the first time in her adult life, like she had something that was completely and entirely hers. When Grandpa Harold passed 6 years ago, she kept the cottage without hesitation. Refused every suggestion from the family that she sell it and simplify. Would drive out there alone on Sunday afternoons and sit on the back porch and watch the tide move in from the Atlantic. Grandma Loretta and I had always had a relationship the rest of the family never quite understood. While Tiffany's visits were polished and brief, mine were long and unplanned. I would call on a Thursday evening and she would say come over, and I would drive to her house in West Ashley and we would sit at her kitchen table for hours talking about everything and nothing at all. About Grandpa Harold. About Charleston and how much it had changed since she was young. About what she believed happened after a person died and whether she was afraid of it. She told me once, during one of those quiet evenings with the windows open and the ceiling fan turning slowly above us, that I reminded her of herself at my age. Quiet in a room full of noise, she said. But watching everything. Remembering everything. I laughed it off at the time the same way you dismiss a compliment that cuts a little too close to something real. On my 25th birthday she called me to her house alone. No family gathering, no performance, no audience. Just the two of us at that kitchen table with a manila envelope resting between our coffee cups. Inside was the deed to the Folly Beach cottage, transferred into my name, notarized and signed with Grandma Loretta's careful old-fashioned handwriting. She pushed it across the table and said, "This is yours, Demi. It has always felt like it was meant for you and I want you to have it while I'm still here to see your face when you get it." I cried. She didn't, but her hands were trembling when she held mine across that table, and that said everything words couldn't. I drove to that cottage alone afterward and sat on the back porch until the sun went all the way down, listening to the ocean push against the shore, feeling for the first time in my adult life like something in this family was mine and only mine. Nobody could reassign it. Nobody could call it impractical. It existed, it had my name on it, and it was real. That was 14 months before Grandma Loretta's birthday dinner. 14 months before my mother walked into the Charleston County Register of Deeds office with a document bearing my forged signature and quietly erased my name from that property record. And I want you to understand something before we continue. I am not a dramatic person. I do not start fires. I do not create conflict for the pleasure of watching it burn. I spent 26 years being the one who adjusted, who absorbed, who made herself smaller so everyone else could feel more comfortable. But there is a difference between peace and submission, and sitting in that parking lot staring at that transfer document, I finally understood which one I had been practicing my whole life. And that distinction, once you finally see it clearly, is something you cannot unfeel, cannot unknow, and cannot keep quietly folding away into the drawer where you keep all the other things you were told not to make difficult. I want to tell you exactly how it happened because the way my mother stole that property was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet and calculated and dressed up in the language of practicality, the same language she had been using against me my entire life. It started 3 months after Grandma Loretta signed the deed over to me, with a phone call I almost didn't think twice about. It was a Wednesday evening in late October. I was at my kitchen table going through case files from work when Mom called. Her voice was breezy, unhurried. The tone she used when she wanted something but hadn't decided yet whether to ask directly or circle around it. She said she had run into Tiffany and Craig and that Craig's accounting business had hit a rough patch. Something about a commercial lease falling through and unexpected expenses stacking up. She said it almost casually, the way you might mention that it rained earlier. Then she said, "You know, that cottage sitting empty most of the time just seems like such a waste when Tiffany could really use the rental income right now." I told her the cottage wasn't sitting empty. I spent weekends there. I was fixing it up slowly the way Grandma Loretta always wanted. Mom made a small sound, the kind that wasn't agreement or disagreement but functioned as both, and then she said, "Well, I'm just saying it might be worth thinking about." I told her I had thought about it. My answer was no. She said goodnight and we hung up, and I remember sitting there for a moment with a strange feeling I couldn't quite name, like watching a weather system form on the horizon and not knowing yet how bad it was going to get. 3 weeks later she called again. This time the tone was different, more businesslike, less casual. She said she had been talking to a property consultant, which I later understood to mean absolutely nothing formal, just a conversation with someone she knew from her church group who had once flipped a house. She said the cottage needed significant structural work and that maintaining a beachfront property on my salary as a paralegal was going to become a burden very quickly. She said Tiffany and Craig were in a position to invest in the property, to really develop it, and that it made more financial sense for someone with actual resources to take it on. I asked her what she was suggesting. She said, "I'm suggesting you be practical, Demi, and not sentimental." There was a new word added to the vocabulary she used to manage me. Not just don't be difficult. Now also don't be sentimental. I told her I was keeping the cottage. She sighed the way she always sighed when I said something she had already decided was wrong, and we ended the call. The third conversation was not a conversation at all. It was a message she left on my voicemail on a Tuesday afternoon when she knew I was in court with one of the attorneys from the firm. She said she needed me to sign some paperwork related to the property, that there were outstanding documents from the original transfer that Grandma Loretta's attorney had flagged, and that she would just need my signature to clear it up. She said she would handle getting it notarized, not to worry about any of that. I called her back that evening and she was brisk and efficient, said it was just administrative, routine, the kind of thing that came up with property transfers and that I shouldn't read too much into it. Because I was tired and because I had a complicated motion due the following morning and because some part of me that I am not proud of still wanted to believe my mother would not deliberately harm me, I told her to send whatever it was and I would look it over that weekend. I never received anything. No email, no physical mail, nothing. I followed up once. She said she was still getting it together. I got busy with work. The weeks moved quickly the way they always do when you are not paying close enough attention, and I did not think about it again until I received the email from Grandma Loretta's attorney, a man named Mr. Beaumont who had handled her estate documents for over 2 decades, informing me that a deed transfer had been recorded with the Charleston County Register of Deeds listing Tiffany and Craig's names as the new owners of the Folly Beach property. The transfer was dated 6 weeks prior. The signature on the document was mine. Except it wasn't. I remember reading that email 4 times. Not because I didn't understand it but because my brain kept refusing to process the full shape of what it meant. My mother had fabricated a document with my forged signature, had it notarized through means I still don't completely understand, walked into a county government office and transferred my property to my sister without my knowledge or consent. She had then said nothing. Not a single word. For 6 weeks she had called me on Sundays, asked how work was going, mentioned what she was planting in the garden, and said nothing. Tiffany had texted me a photo of Lily at her school play and said nothing. 6 weeks of ordinary family contact stretched over a legal crime like a coat of fresh paint over rotting wood. I called Mr. Beaumont the following morning before I went into the office. He was careful and measured the way good attorneys always are, but I could hear something underneath his professionalism, something that sounded almost like controlled outrage. He told me the signature on the transfer document did not match the signature on file from the original deed transfer Grandma Loretta had authorized. He said he had already flagged this with his own records and was in the process of documenting the discrepancy. He asked me directly whether I had signed or authorized any transfer of the property. I told him no. He said he understood, and then he said something that I wrote down on the notepad next to my coffee cup because I knew I would need to hold on to it. He said, "Miss Pritchard, your grandmother is already aware. She called me 3 days ago." I asked him what he meant. He said Grandma Loretta had noticed the contractor's truck parked outside the cottage on one of her Sunday afternoon drives. She had stopped and asked the contractor who had hired him. He told her. She had driven straight home and called Mr. Beaumont before she even took her coat off. I sat with that for a long moment. Grandma Loretta, 74 years old at the time, had driven past her cottage on a quiet Sunday afternoon, seen something that didn't belong, and had immediately understood the entire shape of what had been done without anyone having to explain it to her. Because she knew her daughter. She had always known her daughter. She had just hoped, perhaps, that her daughter would know better than to reach for the one thing that was meant to protect the grandchild she loved most from exactly this kind of reaching. I want to be honest about how I felt in those first days after finding out, because I think people sometimes expect a clean emotion from a story like this. Rage or devastation or steely resolve. What I actually felt was much messier than any of those things. I felt embarrassed, which is strange but true, embarrassed that I had not seen it coming, embarrassed that I had been on the phone with my mother for 6 weeks talking about nothing while she sat on the other end knowing what she had done. I felt something close to grief, not for the property specifically but for the version of my mother I had always quietly hoped existed underneath the one I actually had. The version that, despite everything, might one day look at me and decide I was worth protecting instead of redistributing. I also felt, underneath all of it, something harder and quieter and more durable than any of the louder feelings. I had worked in law long enough to understand what document fraud looked like. I had sat in enough depositions to know what it sounded like when someone had built a case methodically and patiently over time. And Mr. Beaumont's words kept circling back through my mind. Your grandmother is already aware. He called me 3 days ago. Grandma Loretta had not called me. She had not texted, had not shown up at my apartment, had not done any of the things a panicked person does when they first discover something has gone wrong. She had called her attorney. She had been quiet. And if there was one thing I had learned from a lifetime of watching my grandmother move through the world, it was that her silence was never emptiness. It was preparation. 2 weeks before her 75th birthday dinner, she finally called me. Her voice was exactly the same as it always was on our Thursday evening calls, warm and unhurried and full of the particular kind of calm that belongs to people who have lived long enough to understand that most storms, no matter how bad they look on the horizon, eventually have to make landfall and end. She asked me how work was going. She asked if I had been eating properly, which she always asked and I always deflected. And then she said, I need you to come to my birthday dinner, Demi. The whole family will be there. I told her of course I would not miss it. She said, good. Then she paused, and in that pause I heard something I had never quite heard from her before, a kind of quiet certainty that felt less like reassurance and more like a promise. Just come, she said. And let me handle the rest. I didn't ask what she meant. Some part of me already knew that whatever Grandma Loretta had been quietly building over those 2 weeks, it was going to be finished and ready by the time we all sat down to dinner. I just didn't know yet how completely it was going to change everything. The Spectator Hotel sat on a corner of State Street in the heart of downtown Charleston, the kind of building that made you feel the weight of history the moment you stepped through its doors. High ceilings, dark wood paneling, the faint smell of old leather and something floral that seemed built into the walls. Mom had reserved the private dining room on the 2nd floor, the one with the tall windows that looked out over the street and the kind of lighting that made everything look warmer and more civilized than it actually was. 38 family members filled that room. Cousins I had not seen in years. My father's brother, Uncle Dennis, who always smelled like pipe tobacco and had strong opinions about college football. My Aunt Renee on Mom's side, the one who asked every single gathering whether I was seeing anyone yet, and then answered her own question before I could open my mouth. Anne at the center of it all, at the head of the long table in a deep burgundy dress with her silver hair pinned back the way she always wore it for occasions that mattered, sat Grandma Loretta. 75 years old and absolutely, completely in command of herself in a way that I had never appreciated until that night. I had driven to the hotel alone, parked on the street 2 blocks away and sat in my car for a few minutes before going in, the way I always did before family events that required me to walk into a room and pretend everything was fine. I had not spoken to my mother beyond 2 brief functional text exchanges in the 2 weeks since I had found out about the deed transfer. I had not confronted her. Mr. Beaumont had advised me gently but clearly that it would be better to let things develop without tipping my hand, and Grandma Loretta's instruction had been equally clear. Just come and let me handle the rest. So I had spent 2 weeks holding what I knew like a stone in my pocket, heavy and constant, and walking into that hotel meant walking into a room where my mother believed she had already won. Tiffany and Craig arrived just ahead of me. I saw them on the front steps, Craig holding the door while Tiffany adjusted Lily's collar. Tiffany saw me and smiled, the wide, uncomplicated smile of someone who had no idea a single thing was wrong. She looked good, relaxed, the kind of relaxed that comes from having recently gotten exactly what you wanted. She said I looked pretty and asked if I had come alone, and I said yes, and she made a sympathetic sound that I understood was not actually sympathy. We walked in together and took our seats, and the performance of a normal family birthday dinner began. The first hour moved the way those events always do when the surface is holding but the structure underneath is compromised. Toasts were made. Food was ordered. My Aunt Renee asked me about my love life and answered her own question. Lily knocked over a glass of water and Craig mopped it up and everyone laughed. Grandma Loretta sat at the head of the table receiving birthday wishes with a graciousness that was entirely genuine and entirely controlled. And every so often I would catch her eyes moving across the room in a way that had nothing to do with social pleasantries. She was taking inventory. She had been taking inventory all evening. It was during the main course that everything shifted. Grandma Loretta set down her fork, dabbed the corner of her mouth with her napkin, and looked directly down the length of the table at me. Her voice carried easily over the ambient noise of the room, not because she raised it but because she had the kind of presence that made other sounds instinctively lower themselves. "Demi," she said, "I drove past the cottage last Sunday. I noticed some new work being done on the back porch." The table did not go quiet immediately. A few conversations continued for another beat or two before the tone of what was happening registered and the room gradually pulled its attention toward the head of the table. I put my own fork down. I looked at her. I said, "I haven't been out to the cottage recently, Grandma." She nodded slowly as if I had confirmed something she already knew. "No," she said. "I didn't think so." From across the table, I watched my mother's expression go through 3 distinct changes in the space of about 2 seconds. The first was surprise because she had not expected the cottage to come up. The second was calculation, a rapid, visible assessment of the situation. The third was the smile, the same warm, practiced smile she had been deploying my entire life to reframe reality into something more convenient. She leaned slightly forward and addressed the table in the tone she used for announcements. "Oh, that's actually wonderful news," she said, and I could hear the social architecture going up in real time, brick by careful brick. Demi decided that with everything going on, the cottage made more practical sense for Tiffany's family. Tiffany and Craig are going to do a beautiful renovation. It was Demi's idea, really. So generous. She looked around the table at the relatives who were now paying attention, gathering their nods the way she always gathered consensus, preemptively before anyone had the chance to think too carefully about what they were agreeing to. A few people smiled. Aunt Renee said something about how lovely that was. Someone near the end of the table murmured that it was very mature of me. I sat completely still. My hands were flat on the table and I was looking at my grandmother and my grandmother was looking at my mother and the expression on her face was not anger. It was something far more deliberate than anger. It was the expression of someone who had heard exactly what they expected to hear and was now ready to proceed. "Patricia." Grandma Loretta's voice was quiet and even and filled every corner of the room. "Did Demi sign a document authorizing that transfer?" Mom's smile held for just a moment longer than it should have before she adjusted it. "Mother, this really isn't the time for paperwork discussions at a birthday dinner." "I'm not asking about paperwork," Grandma Loretta said. "I'm asking whether my granddaughter agreed to give away her property." Mom set down her wine glass. "Of course she did. We discussed it as a family." "Demi." Grandma Loretta looked at me, and in the directness of her gaze was something I had never been given so plainly before in a room full of our family. Permission to speak the truth without managing the consequences first. "Did you agree to this?" The table was completely silent now. 38 people and the quiet that happens when a room understands that something real is occurring underneath the occasion it thought it was attending. I looked at my mother. I looked at Tiffany, whose expression had shifted from comfortable to uncertain, the relaxed confidence she had walked in with quietly draining away. I looked back at my grandmother. "No," I said. "I didn't agree to anything. I found out about the transfer from Mr. Beaumont 2 weeks ago. The signature on the document is not mine." The silence that followed that sentence was a different kind of silence than the one before it. Someone near the middle of the table said, "What?" in a very small voice. Uncle Dennis set down his fork with a sound that seemed much louder than it should have been. Tiffany turned to look at Craig and Craig was staring at the tablecloth. Mom stood up from her chair, not with the composed authority she usually projected but with the sudden energy of someone who has just seen the ground shift beneath them and needs to move before they lose their footing entirely. "This is completely overblown," she said, and her voice had a new quality in it, something thin and pressurized that I had never heard from her before. "There was a miscommunication. These things happen with property documents. It can all be sorted out quietly without turning a birthday dinner into some kind of tribunal. Sit down, Patricia. Grandma Loretta had not raised her voice once. He did not need to. The instruction landed in the room with the quiet, absolute weight of someone who has decided that a conversation is going to happen and has already accounted for every possible objection. Mom sat. Tiffany looked like she wanted to disappear through the back of her chair. Lily, too young to understand any of what was happening, was quietly building something out of her bread roll and completely unaware that the room around her had transformed into something none of them had been invited to. I want to be very clear about something, Grandma Loretta said, and she was addressing the room now, not just my mother, her eyes moving calmly across the faces of every person at that table, because Patricia has just told all of you a story about generosity, and I think you deserve to know the full story before you decide what to make of it. She reached for the small clutch bag resting on the table beside her water glass, the one I had noticed when I first sat down and had not thought anything of at the time. She opened it and placed a folded document on the table in front of her, smoothing it flat with one hand. Mr. Beaumont could not be here tonight, she said. But he made sure I had everything I needed. Mom's face had gone the color of old plaster. Mother, whatever you think you have, I know exactly what I have, Patricia. Grandma Loretta looked at my mother with the steady, patient clarity of someone who has been waiting a very long time to say exactly this. The question is whether you're ready to explain it to everyone in this room. Nobody moved. The room had the particular stillness of people who understood they were witnessing something they would be talking about for years, and nobody wanted to miss a single word of it. Grandma Loretta unfolded the document in front of her with the unhurried precision of someone who had rehearsed this moment not out of nervousness but out of respect for its importance. She smoothed it flat against the white tablecloth and looked at my mother the way you look at someone when you are giving them one final opportunity to choose a different path before the one they are already on becomes irreversible. Patricia, she said, I am going to give you a chance right now to tell this family the truth. Whatever you say in the next 30 seconds will determine how the rest of this evening goes. Mom's jaw tightened. Her eyes moved around the table and I watched her do the calculation she always did in high-pressure moments, scanning the room for allies, for sympathetic faces, for anyone she could pull into her corner before the ground gave out entirely. Dad sat 3 seats down from her, his face unreadable in the way it always was when Mom and reality were in direct conflict. He had a lifelong talent for being physically present and emotionally unavailable during moments that required him to choose. Uncle Dennis was watching my mother with an expression I had never seen him direct at her before. Not hostility exactly, but the specific withdrawal of benefit of the doubt. Aunt Renee had both hands around her water glass and was staring at the tablecloth. Mom looked at Grandma Loretta. Then she looked at me. And then she did the thing I should have predicted but somehow still did not. He pivoted. I did what was best for this family, she said, and her voice had found a new register, lower and more serious, the tone she used when she wanted to reframe a conflict as a sacrifice. Tiffany has a child. She has a mortgage, she has a business that is struggling, she has real responsibilities that require real resources. Demi is young, she is single, she has no dependents. The cottage was an asset that was going to sit underused when it could have been making a difference for a family that needed it. She spread her hands on the table as if laying out something reasonable. I made a judgment call. I handled the paperwork because I knew Demi would resist and I knew that if I asked her directly she would say no out of stubbornness rather than thinking about what was actually right for everyone. The room absorbed that. I absorbed it. The audacity of the argument was so complete, so perfectly constructed in its own logic, that for a moment it almost sounded like a position a reasonable person could hold. Almost. Then Tiffany spoke and everything changed again. Mom. Her voice was very quiet. What do you mean you handled the paperwork? Mom turned to look at her older daughter. I took care of it, Tiffany. That's all. Demi just said her signature was forged. Tiffany's voice had a quality in it I had not heard before, something careful and slightly afraid. Are you saying you forged her signature? I am saying I made a decision that needed to be made and I handled the administrative side of it. The details are not the point. The details are absolutely the point. Tiffany pushed back from the table slightly, creating a few inches of physical distance between herself and what she was hearing. Mom, if Demi didn't sign that document, then how did her name get on it? Silence. Mom. More silence. Craig reached for Tiffany's arm and she moved it away from him, not toward me, just away from him, the gesture of someone who needed to think without being managed. Grandma Loretta let the silence sit for exactly long enough. Then she lifted the document and read from it in a clear, measured voice. "This is a letter from Mr. Beaumont dated 4 days ago," she said. "He has compared the signature on the deed transfer filed with Charleston County against the authenticated signature on the original deed transfer I authorized for Demi 14 months ago. He has also compared it against Demi's signature on file at her firm, which he obtained through a professional colleague." She looked up. "His conclusion in writing is that the signatures do not match. The variance is, and I am quoting directly, consistent with forgery rather than natural variation." Someone at the far end of the table exhaled audibly. Uncle Dennis said something very quietly to the woman beside him. Dad finally moved, leaning forward with his elbows on the table, rubbing his forehead with both hands. Mom stood up again, and this time her composure had fractured along visible lines. "A letter from an attorney is not a legal determination," she said, and there was something almost performative about the confidence in her voice now. The kind of confidence that has run out of actual ground to stand on and is simply refusing to acknowledge the drop. Anyone can write a letter with an opinion. That does not mean anything has been proven. This is a family matter and it will be handled as a family matter through the proper channels and not as a dinner table spectacle. She looked around the room as if appealing to the collective decency of people who had just heard her admit to making a unilateral decision with forged documentation. "I think we should table this conversation, have some birthday cake and let cooler heads prevail. Sit down, Patricia." It was not Grandma Loretta this time. It was Uncle Dennis. His voice was low and entirely without theatrics. The voice of a man who had been sitting patiently through something he found deeply unpleasant and had reached the end of his patience. Mom looked at him. Something in his expression made her sit. Dennis had always been the quiet one in the family, the one who showed up, helped without being asked, and expressed opinions rarely and only when he had decided they were necessary. When he spoke in a room it had weight precisely because he so seldom used it. "You forged your daughter's signature on a property deed," Dennis said. He was not asking. He was stating it the way you state something that has just been confirmed and now needs to be acknowledged out loud before anything else can happen. "You walked into a government office with a fraudulent document and transferred property that did not belong to you." Mom opened her mouth. "I'm not finished," Dennis said. "I have sat at this family's table for 30 years. I have watched you manage these 2 girls since they were small children, and I have kept my mouth shut because it was not my house and not my business. But this is not a parenting decision. This is not a judgment call about family resources. What you are describing is a crime, Patricia. And sitting here letting you call it a miscommunication or a family matter is something I am not willing to do." The word crime dropped into the room like something physical. I watched several people around the table react to it, the slight flinch of hearing something named plainly that everyone had been circling around. Tiffany had both hands flat on the table and was staring at them. Lily had fallen asleep against Craig's arm and Craig looked like a man who was very carefully not saying anything and was acutely aware that this was probably the wisest decision he had ever made. Mom turned to my father. "Richard." The word was a summons, a demand, the reflex of a woman who had always been able to pull my father into alignment when she needed a unified front. Dad looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at me. Something moved across his face that I did not have a name for but that I recognized as significant because I had never seen it there before. It was not exactly guilt. It was closer to the expression of a person who has been standing at a distance from something for so long that they have convinced themselves they were neutral, and have just realized that neutrality was its own kind of participation. "Patricia," he said quietly, "I think you need to let your mother speak." Mom stared at him. The betrayal in her expression was so naked that it was almost uncomfortable to witness, the look of someone whose most reliable instrument has just declined to function. She turned back to the room and for the first time in the entire evening, I saw something in my mother's face that I had genuinely never seen there before. Not remorse, not quite, but the first hairline crack in the absolute certainty with which she had always moved through the world and through our family. The certainty that her version of events was the correct one. The certainty that what was good for Tiffany was good enough to justify anything. The certainty that I would, as I always had, absorb whatever was done to me and eventually adjust. Grandma Loretta reached into her clutch a second time. She placed another document on the table beside the first one and smoothed it flat with the same careful, deliberate hands. "There is more," she said simply. And the way she said it, without drama, without satisfaction, just the plain statement of a woman who had come to her 75th birthday dinner prepared for exactly this and was not remotely finished, made my mother close her eyes for just a moment. As if she already knew what was coming and had known all along that this was always how it was going to end. I looked at Grandma Loretta across that long table, past the crystal glasses and the half-eaten plates and the stunned faces of 38 people who had arrived expecting birthday cake and were getting something else entirely. She met my eyes and gave me the smallest, steadiest nod I have ever received from another human being. It was not reassurance. It was notification. We were not done. Not even close. The second document Grandma Loretta placed on the table was not a letter from Mr. Beaumont. It was something older, something with the particular texture of paper that has been handled carefully and stored deliberately over a long period of time. She unfolded it slowly and I could see from where I sat that it was handwritten, 2 pages, the ink slightly faded at the edges. She did not read from it immediately. She set it flat on the table in front of her and looked at my mother with an expression that carried something I had not seen in it before that evening. Not anger, not satisfaction, but something closer to sorrow. The sorrow of a person who had hoped, somewhere underneath all the preparation, that it would not actually come to this. "Before Grandpa Harold passed," Grandma Loretta said, addressing the room but watching my mother, "he sat down with me and wrote out what he wanted for this family after he was gone. Not a formal will. Not a legal document. Just a letter in his own handwriting, about what he believed a family owed its members. What it meant to take care of one another properly." She touched the pages lightly with her fingertips. "He wrote it for me. But he also wrote it because he had seen things in this family that worried him. Things he was too gentle to say out loud but felt strongly enough about to put on paper." She paused. "He wrote about Demi by name. The room reacted to that. I reacted to that. I had not known this document existed. Grandma Loretta had never mentioned it in any of our Thursday evening conversations, not once in 2 years of sitting at her kitchen table talking about Grandpa Harold and the early years and the things he had believed about how people should treat each other. She had kept it for 6 years and brought it tonight because she had known, with the same quiet certainty she brought to everything, that she was going to need it. "He wrote," she continued, her voice steady and unhurried, "that he had noticed over the years how differently his 2 granddaughters were treated in this family. He wrote that Tiffany was loved loudly and Demi was loved in ways that asked her to make herself smaller to deserve it. He wrote that this was the kind of thing that looked like nothing from the outside and felt like everything from the inside." She looked at me then, directly, and her eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with the chandelier light. "He said Demi reminded him of me when I was young. He said she had the kind of quiet that gets mistaken for contentment when it is actually patience. And he wrote that he hoped someone in this family would make sure she knew before too long that she did not have to keep being patient forever." Nobody at that table spoke. My father had his hands folded in front of him and was looking at them. Uncle Dennis had his arms crossed and his jaw set. Tiffany was crying, not the polished, composed tears of someone performing an emotion but the unguarded, slightly ugly crying of someone who has been ambushed by a grief they did not know they were carrying. Craig had his hand on her back. Aunt Renee had her fingers pressed to her lips. Even the ambient noise beyond the closed dining room doors seemed to have dropped away entirely. Mom had not moved. She was sitting very still in a way that was entirely unlike her. The stillness of a person whose mechanisms for managing a situation have run out of options and who has not yet found a new strategy to reach for. I watched her look at the handwritten pages in her mother's hands and I saw something cross her face that I want to be careful about describing accurately, because I think it matters. It was not guilt in the clean sense. It was something more complicated, the expression of a person confronting the gap between who they believed themselves to be and what the evidence of their own actions was showing them in a room full of witnesses. Patricia Pritchard had always understood herself as a good mother. A practical one perhaps, one who made hard decisions without sentiment but a good one. Grandpa Harold's words, delivered 6 years after his death by the woman who had kept them carefully for exactly the right moment, were doing something to that self-understanding that no argument, no confrontation, no amount of my quiet resistance over 26 years had ever managed to do. Grandma Loretta set the pages down and folded her hands over them. I kept this letter because Harold asked me to use it wisely, she said. I have been waiting for the right moment for 6 years. I did not want to use it over a small slight or a careless remark. I wanted to use it when it was truly necessary. She looked at my mother. Patricia, you forged your daughter's signature and stole her property. I believe Harold would agree that this qualifies. She turned to address the wider table. I want everyone in this room to understand what is going to happen now because this is not a negotiation and it is not a discussion. It is simply what will occur. Uncle Dennis leaned forward slightly. Aunt Renee lowered her hands from her mouth. 38 people who had come to a birthday dinner were now sitting in the kind of stillness that only happens when everyone in a room understands that what they are hearing is a verdict. Mr. Beaumont has already filed a formal dispute with the Charleston County Register of Deeds on the basis of signature fraud, Grandma Loretta said. The transfer will be voided. Demi's name will be restored to the deed. This process is already underway and does not require Patricia's cooperation or consent to complete. Mom made a sound that was not quite a word. Grandma Loretta continued without acknowledging it. Furthermore, Mr. Beaumont has documented everything, the forged signature, the fraudulent notarization, the filing with the county, and has advised Demi of her full legal options. What Demi chooses to do with that information is entirely her decision. I will support whatever she decides. She looked at me and the room looked at me, and for a moment the weight of all those eyes was enormous. The way it is when a room full of people suddenly understands that the person they had been watching from a distance all evening was not a passive participant in a family drama but the center of it, the one it had always been about. I had spent my entire life in this family trying to take up the least possible amount of space. Trying to be easy, uncomplicated, low maintenance, not difficult, not sentimental, not a problem. And sitting in that room with my grandmother's eyes on me and Grandpa Harold's words still hanging in the air and my mother sitting silent for the first time I could ever remember, I felt something release in my chest that I had not realized I had been holding for years. I stood up. Not dramatically, not with the energy of someone who has been building to a speech. Just the simple act of standing up in a room where I had been seated at the far end of the table near the cousins I barely knew, and letting myself take up the space that had always been mine to take. I want to say something, I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected. I looked at my mother. I'm not going to stand here and tell you that I hate you. I don't. But I need you to understand something clearly, and I need everyone in this room to hear it because you made this a public conversation when you announced my generosity to 38 people who are all still sitting here. Mom said nothing. I continued. I have spent my entire life being the one who adjusts. The one who understands. The one who doesn't make things difficult. I have accepted less because I was told that was what a good daughter did, what a good sister did, what a practical person who understood the needs of her family did. I accepted it for so long that I think you genuinely stopped seeing it as something you were asking of me and started seeing it as just who I was. I paused. But this is who I am. Someone who is done being managed. Someone who knows what belongs to her. Someone who is not going to sign over anything literally or otherwise, ever again without being asked directly and deciding for herself. I looked at Tiffany. She was still crying and she held my gaze without looking away, which cost her something. I could see that and I respected it. I don't blame you for all of it, I said. But I need you to be my sister going forward, not a second version of the person who decides what I should be willing to give up. Ask me. So, just ask me. She nodded once and pressed her hand to her mouth, and I believed her. Grandma Loretta was watching me from the head of the table, and her expression was the same one she had worn in her kitchen 14 months ago when she pushed that envelope across the table toward me. Like she had always known exactly who I was going to turn out to be and had simply been waiting for me to find out for myself. She reached across and placed her hand briefly over mine as I sat back down, warm and dry and entirely certain. Harold would have loved this, she said softly, just to me. He really would have. The birthday cake arrived 12 minutes later. White layers, cream cheese frosting, 75 candles that took Lily 3 attempts to help blow out, and the kind of slightly stunned recalibrating energy of a room that has been through something real and is slowly finding its way back to the surface. Mom and Dad left before the cake was fully sliced. Not dramatically, just quietly, the way people exit when they understand that the occasion has moved beyond them. Tiffany stayed. She sat beside me for the rest of the evening and we did not talk about any of it, not that night, and that was exactly right. 8 months have passed since that birthday dinner at the Spectator Hotel. 8 months since Grandma Loretta placed 2 documents on a white tablecloth in front of 38 people and quietly dismantled the story my mother had been telling about our family for as long as I could remember. 8 months since I stood up at the far end of that table and said out loud in front of everyone that I was done being the one who adjusted. I am telling you this from the back porch of the Folly Beach cottage on a Thursday evening in early June, the Atlantic out there in the last of the daylight, moving in and out without asking anyone's permission. And I want to tell you what happened after the cake was cut and the room slowly emptied and the rest of our lives resumed without the architecture we had all been living inside for so long. The deed was restored to my name 6 weeks after the dinner. Mr. Beaumont handled the filing and the county processed the correction without complication, because document fraud, once properly documented and submitted to the right office by the right attorney, tends to resolve itself with a kind of administrative decisiveness that the original crime never anticipated. I was present when the corrected deed was finalized. I drove to Mr. Beaumont's office on a Tuesday morning, signed my actual signature in my actual handwriting, and walked out with a copy of a document that had my name on it in the way my name was supposed to be on it. I sat in my car afterward for a few quiet minutes, not crying and not celebrating, just sitting with the particular stillness of something being returned that should never have been taken in the first place. The contractor Tiffany and Craig had hired to renovate the back porch had completed about 40% of the work before the dispute was filed and the project was halted. Craig called me 3 weeks after the dinner and asked, in a voice that was careful and slightly uncomfortable, what I wanted done about the remaining materials and whether I had any preference about the contractor finishing the work or not. It was the most direct and considerate thing Craig had ever said to me in the 10 years I had known him. I told him I appreciated the call, that I would handle it myself, and that I had no hard feelings toward him personally. He said he was sorry. I believed him. He's not a bad man. He is a man who had been handed a situation and had not asked the questions he should have asked, which made him complicit in the way that passivity always makes a person complicit without making them malicious. I have learned to distinguish carefully between those two things. My mother called me for the first time 5 weeks after the dinner. Not 4 weeks, not 3. Her voice when I answered was the voice of a woman who had spent considerable time deciding how to begin a conversation she did not want to have and had settled on sounding as normal as possible to see if normal still worked. He asked how I was doing. I told her I was fine. He asked about work. I told her work was good. Then she said she wanted to put what happened behind us, that things had gotten bigger than they needed to and she would like for us to move forward. I let the silence sit for a moment before I responded, not for effect but because I genuinely needed a beat to decide what was true. Then I said I was willing to have a relationship with her, but that moving forward was not the same as pretending backward. That the deed transfer was fraud. That she knew that, I knew that, and 38 members of our family knew that, and I was not going to perform amnesia about it to make things more comfortable. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she understood. It was not an apology, but it was the first time in my memory that my mother had said I understand to me rather than expecting me to say it to her. And I chose to treat it as the beginning of something rather than the absence of something else. We have spoken 8 times since that call. Carefully, in the way that people speak when they are rebuilding something that broke along a fault line that was always there. She has not offered a real apology, not in the full sense, not in the way that names what she did and takes ownership of it without qualification. I do not know if she ever will. I have made my peace with that possibility, because I have learned that waiting for an apology as the condition for your own healing is a way of handing someone who has already hurt you a second instrument of control. My peace is not contingent on her arriving at remorse on a timeline that suits me. My peace is something I have built myself, in this cottage, on this porch, in the Thursday evening calls with my grandmother that continue exactly as they always have. Tiffany and I had our real conversation 6 weeks after the dinner. Not the brief exchange at the table, not the careful texts in the days that followed, but an actual hours-long conversation at a restaurant on East Bay Street where we ordered too much food and ate very little of it and talked about things we had genuinely never talked about before. She told me that she had known, somewhere underneath everything, that our family's dynamic was not equal. That she had known it the way you know something you have decided not to examine because examining it would require you to act on it and acting on it would cost you something. She said that was not an excuse. I told her I knew it wasn't. She told me that when Grandpa Harold's letter was read at that dinner table and she heard him describe the way I had been treated, something broke open in her that she was still working through. Hearing his words put to it so plainly had made her understand in a way that years of ambient awareness never had, that what I had lived inside our family was not just a difference in parenting style or natural favoritism. It was a deprivation. Sustained and systematic. She cried when she said that. I did not cry, but I reached across the table and held her hand, and we sat like that for a long while without speaking. Two sisters at a restaurant on a Wednesday afternoon, doing the quiet, unglamorous work of actually knowing each other for the very first time. We will probably never be the sisters who call each other every single day or share the kind of effortless closeness that some siblings have. But we are honest with each other now in a way we never were before. And I have come to understand that honesty between people with a complicated history is its own form of intimacy, harder one and more durable than the easy kind. She asks me things now about how I am, what I think, what I want. She asked last month if she and Lily could come to the cottage for a weekend. Directly, no assumption built into the question, just a genuine inquiry waiting for a genuine answer. I said yes. They came on a Saturday in May, and Lily ran straight to the water, and Tiffany and I sat on the back porch drinking coffee and watched her daughter play in the Atlantic and did not talk about any of it. We did not need to. Dad and I exist at a careful, honest distance from each other. He called 2 weeks after the dinner and said he was sorry he had not spoken up sooner, not just at the dinner itself but across all the years before it. He said it plainly and without ornamentation, and I received it the same way. He is not going to become a different man at 61. He is going to continue being someone who finds conflict deeply uncomfortable and who has too often chosen the easier path over the right one. But he said sorry, and he meant it, and that matters to me, even though it does not fix anything, because I have also learned that not everything needs to be fixed to be acknowledged. Grandma Loretta and I sit on this back porch together most Sunday afternoons now. She brings the tea, I supply the chairs, and we talk about everything the way we always have, except that nothing is hidden anymore and nothing has to be carefully managed around what the rest of the family knows or doesn't know. She told me a few weeks ago, on a warm evening with the light going gold over the water, that she had worried for years she had waited too long, let too many Sunday afternoons pass before finally doing what she did at that dinner. I told her the timing was exactly right. She said she hoped so. Then she was quiet in the particular way she is quiet when she is deciding how to say something precisely. She said her husband used to tell her that the right moment for a hard thing was not when it was easiest but when it would land the deepest. I have thought about those words many times since that evening, sitting in the same chair, watching the same tide move in, feeling like someone who has finally stopped shrinking to fit a space that was always too small for her. I am 26 years old. I am a paralegal at a firm on Broad Street in downtown Charleston. I have a small apartment on Rutledge Avenue and a beach cottage on Folly Beach with a repaired back porch and a back gate latch I finally fixed myself 2 months ago, just like Grandma Loretta always meant to. I have a family that is complicated and imperfect and slowly, genuinely becoming more honest than it has ever been. And I have learned at 26, something that some people spend their entire lives circling without ever quite landing on. That the space you take up in this world is not something other people get to measure out for you in careful portions and call it love. It was always yours. Every inch of it. You simply have to stop apologizing for the room you were always born deserving to fill. If this story made you feel something, don't just scroll away. There are so many stories out there that never get told, and here on Confire Stories we bring them to life. So if you enjoy emotional real-life drama like this, take a second to subscribe and be part of the journey. And if you've ever been in a situation like this, or have a story of your own, share it in the comments. I read them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.